All right. Hello, I'm Dave Steer. It's nice to meet all of you on day 2 of the summit. I hope everyone's energy is as great as day 1 was, because day 1 was pretty awesome. So I'm going to talk to you about this concept called trust, which is, I think, both one of the most important things that we as marketers can do to engender, and one of the most elusive things. And it can feel like everything and nothing at the same time, which is awful because it leaves you feel like you don't have agency and you can't do anything about it. Well, the simple answer that I have for you is that we can do something about it. But we're faced with a bunch of challenges. So I'll talk to you a little bit about my background, but mostly as a frame to get into how we think about trust, how we define trust, and then I will give you a framework, because we all like frameworks. So I'll start it with this. The core premise that I have, which I believe I share with almost all of you, is that trust is a central part of the go-to-market process in terms of building strong brands and strong products. It has to be there. If our customers don't trust it, it's not going to work. And yet, we've got this perfect storm of things that are going on. I almost thought about titling this talk, we have a trust problem, but that felt a little bit negative. So I decided that I actually believe that we as marketers are the trust engineers of the go-to-market process. But we have to understand what we're facing. And so what we're facing are, I think, 2 challenges. First, a complete rising in distrust among the people who we're talking to, and at the same time, a lack of framework for us to actually do anything about it. So I'm going to go into that right now. So I'll start with a quick version of my origin story. Early in my career, I was a trust marketing person at eBay. My job was to build trust between buyers and sellers and between the community and eBay overall. And this is kind of early days of being online and buying and selling things online. So the idea of transacting with a complete stranger took a huge leap of faith. If you were the buyer, you were worried that you were going to get defrauded. If you're the seller, you were worried that you were going to get a chargeback, or even worse, somebody would leave you with a negative review, which would impact your business going forward. And so as the product marketer, I was in charge of a product called Dispute Resolution. And we thought it would be a great product. You put a dispute resolution platform in front of a buyer and seller, they can fix their problems without eBay having to come in and be sort of the middle person in between being judge and jury. And boy, did we get it wrong. We launched the product, and the most active people in the community went nuts. They were like, eBay, you're changing things on us. You're abdicating your role as sort of the platform owner. You're not communicating with us in a way that makes it clear what you're doing and why you're doing it, and we're confused. And so that was a humbling experience, to think that you're going to get it right, you launched it, and to get that kind of feedback back. And I think one of the things that I learned in that process was both that trust can be lofty, but unless you have a framework to use to help you figure out what the right thing to do is, you're kind of lost. And then 2, you can't control trust. You can enable trust. And so to enable trust, you have to understand a lot of sociology, which is why a lot of us got into this field in the first place, to understand the psychology behind how people interact with each other, the emotions that people have, and that's where trust fits. So I believe if we can get trust right, if we have the right frameworks, we're going to be essentially, in our go-to-market process, truly differentiated, because we're going to be marketing both at a higher sort of emotional level with our customer, and then even higher than that, we will have been bonded with a customer as we do it. And that is a moat that few people can break. And so over my career, I've really seen these patterns. They go from place to place, whether or not it's business to consumer or business to business. I've seen how a lot of these patterns, come up from the standpoint of what does trust look like, who is involved, what do they do. And so one of the things that I've learned in doing this is that you can have the best positioning statement, the best message house, but if it's built on a broken, untrusted experience, then it's not going to mean anything. So my main message is this. Trust is the central differentiating factor in your go-to-market strategy, and you as marketers are the trust engineers of, we got the right slides back up, good, of the process. Okay, so let's talk trust. So I'm going to do something kind of uncomfortable with all of you, but I learned it yesterday from our host and what she did during her session. I'm going to ask all of you to stand up, please. We're going to do a little bit of interactive for about 2 to 3 minutes. Get the juices flowing. And we're going to talk trust. Okay, so first thing I want you to do, find a conversation buddy. It's 2 people, probably somebody around you, maybe in back of you. Buddy number 1 is trust. Buddy number 2 is distrust. And so I have a prompt for you. Okay, good. People are meeting each other. That's a really good thing. So the question I have is for buddy number 1, visualize a brand you trust and ask yourself a set of questions. Do you trust them because they promised you something? Do you trust them for what they stand for? If they wronged you, would you still trust them? Is your trust enduring or is it fickle? So that's buddy number 1. Buddy number 2, I want you to think about this. Why do you distrust that brand? Same brand. Different. Visualize a brand that you distrust at that point. Do you distrust them because of a negative experience? Do you distrust them because you heard from someone that had a negative experience? It was word of mouth. Do you distrust the company, but you trust the product? And then how does that impact the way that you interact with the product or the company? So you have 3 minutes. Buddy 1 start, and then go to buddy 2.
Your notes were advancing and your screen wasn't. Is everything cool now?
Now it's cool.
Okay. That's right too.
That's right now, yeah. It was jarring, yeah. I was like, what? Buddy 1 goes first. Good idea. All right, buddy 1, now switch to buddy 2. All right, 30 more seconds, everyone. 30 more seconds. All right, everyone. All right, if everyone can wrap it up. Is this thing on? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, everybody, let's sit down. All right, so can everybody hear me? Sit down, sit down. All right. Well, that was a fun exercise. Definitely got a lot of energy in the room. You know, it's kind of easy when you say, like, visualize a brand you trust. Something happens in the brain. A logo appears, and then you can talk about that. And something even faster happens when you say, what's a brand that you distrust? It, like, immediately will pop in your head. And having those as questions in terms of framing, really helps us contextualize what trust is and what distrust is and what it means. I think repeatedly through our talk today, you're going to see that the way that people interact with each other and the feelings and the emotions that they have when it comes to trust and distrust translate almost 100% to the way that humans interact with the brands and products that they trust as well. And so thinking about it through that lens really helps. I've found out a couple things, and I bet you all did too as well. We have our shared definitions of trust, and we have things that are very sort of unique to us. And so as a marketer, it's very difficult to figure out what to do about it. Again, trust is everything and nothing at the same time. But if everybody has a different definition of trust, like people have different definitions of what love is, then it's really hard to actually do something with it. And so I thought what I would do is share how I define trust and what it means for all of us as marketers. And I've got 4 things that I think about. So first, trust is subjective and contextual. Important to know. It is subjective. Your feelings of trust are different than other people's feelings of trust. So there can be a wide array of trust levels between the audience that you're trying to serve. You can have the best persona, by the way, but even within the persona, they're going to have different sort of levels of trust that they have with your brand and your product. It's also contextual, just to make it even more complicated. The same person might trust a product or a brand in one context, but not in another context. And so as a marketer, what does that mean? For me, the way I apply it is I think very clearly about what the job to be done is, and I get crystal clear on that. And then what I do is I say there's a segmented messaging approach that has to be applied after understanding that job to be done, finding the right message to the right consumer or customer at the right time. So if it's subjective and contextual, understand the job and understand who you need to communicate and be really precise in how you do it. Okay, secondly, trust is a social bond. It's innately wired into our DNA because we're social creatures. So that's important to know. And that's not just about how people interact with each other. Trust is that way because it is a social thing and it's bonded with people and brands and products. And it's really strengthened by this idea of reliance. And so us as marketers understanding that customers rely on us and we rely on them really gets into insights about how we can put it into the marketing that we have, which we'll go through in a second. Okay, trust is a rational and emotional cognitive assessment. It's based on belief, right? It's based on belief that what you say you're gonna do, you're actually gonna do. But it's both right brain and left brain. There's an emotion that's tied to it. And primary on that emotion is vulnerability. And so who here has read Brené Brown? Anyone? Okay. She talks about this a lot, the idea of being vulnerable to other people. Trust is rooted in that idea. And so as a marketer, we need to understand this, that our customers have fears and sort of anxieties. And so how can we understand what those fears and anxieties are at different points of the customer experience without harping on them too much, without creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt because you know it already exists? How can you create an aspirational, uplifting, values-driven message that addresses this part? And then finally, trust is a journey. It's built over time. This implies a couple of things. First, trust isn't built overnight, and we're going to go through the trusted customer journey in a second. But second, as a marketer, think of it like a bank account. And this is kind of a cliche that is used in trust, and I think it's completely accurate. It's almost like a bank account. You deposit often, withdraw wisely. I have a colleague who's in charge of GitLab's entire remote working policy. He has been advocating for remote work for 3 years. And when he and I were talking about this framework, he's like, oh my gosh, every interview I've done, every blog that I've written, every white paper that's been out there, every case study, that's all been a trust deposit. And so it really came in clearly for him. All right, so if it's a journey, where do we start this journey? And I say, as marketers, we always start with a customer. So I'm gonna give you 2 data points that I think really frame this pretty well. First, what's going on with them? Their senses are overloaded. They are getting a ton of of advertising brand-oriented messages a day. A recent study that came out showed that the typical consumer that's out there sees 5,000 brand messages every day, which is a massive increase over what it was 30 years ago. So they're just getting inundated with advertising. And what do? They tune it out. And so if they're tuning it out, as marketers, we can't just advertise our way into the consumer mindset and build trust and confidence with them. So that's the first thing. Their senses are overloaded, and they're tuning us out. Thing number two, which I think is the most serious thing for us to consider, and why the framework that we're about to go through is so important, is they have a new default. The new default is distrust. This is from a survey from PR firm Edelman. They've been doing a great longitudinal study for the past 20 years on trust, and they come out with it every year. This year they came out and found that fully 60% of folks default to trust. They don't trust something at first until they see proof that it's actually trustworthy. So what does that mean for us? It means that the traditional default of trust but verify doesn't exist anymore. They're starting with distrust, and we need to understand that. Senses are overloaded, their default is trust. All right, so what are we going to do with all this doom and gloom? There's actually a framework that we can use, and I think this framework is based on patterns that I've seen, again, in B2C and B2B and working with developers, and I think it's a practical way to do it. I'm also going to give you concrete examples. My concrete examples are going to be from GitLab, but I'm not trying to sell you GitLab. I'm just using it as a way to sort of ground what we're doing. But I think as I do that, you'll see the GitLab examples and you'll go, oh, okay, I see how I could do this in my company. So I'll give you the examples, and then I really want you to think, how do I apply that to the work that I'm doing? So the trust framework is this. It's got 5 things: values, transparency and accountability, consistency and dependability, customer advocacy, and what I call the trust journey, the anxiety-free customer experience. So we're going to go through each of the pillars. So the first pillar is values. Values are basically the codification of what you believe in, the behaviors that you have. They're codifying norms of how people behave for the types of behaviors that you will reward and encourage. A lot of people think that values is fantastic. Let's just put posters on our headquarter wall saying that we all trust each other and we work well together and all of that. And most of them think that it's an internal thing. I think the best brands out there are doing internal and external, values-driven marketing. And I think one of the reasons why they're doing it is they understand that the newest crop of consumers that are out there are craving brands that align with their values. They're choosing where to work because of values. They're choosing who to buy from because of values. And if values aren't there, the bond isn't as tight. And so in order to do this right, again, it needs to be more than words. It needs to be more than posters on your internal wall. It needs to be documented. It needs to be authentic, and you need to bring it into the day-to-day work that you do. So what does that look like? So an example of this is what we do at GitLab. We've got our what we call the credit values. It stands for collaboration, results, efficiency, diversity, equity, and inclusion, iteration, and transparency. We talk about these dozens of times per day. After a meeting, it is not infrequent for us to say, like, hey, did we really live by our values in this way? But the biggest point is we also talk about it externally. And so it's publicly available. Anybody can see the values. And we reference it a lot in our sort of comms that we have out there. And I think the most complicated one of the 5, and I'll get to this in a second, is the idea of iteration. So we talk about iteration. Iteration, the idea is take something big, take a big problem, and break it down into smaller chunks, and then iterate over time. It's great from a marketing perspective because what you do is you can ship fast, you put something in the market, you get feedback from people, and then you can bring it back in and improve and improve and improve. But what's the problem with that? You have to put yourself out there. You have to be vulnerable. You have to understand that you're not going to get it right the first time you put something out there. And so the vulnerability that I brought up earlier comes into play with a value like iteration. So we talk about iteration a lot. And so step 1, values. Second pillar of the trust framework is transparency and accountability. So transparency basically is operating in such a way that's easy for your customers, your team, and everyone to see the actions that you perform. It implies an openness. It requires precise communication, both about the what and the why. What decision did you make? Why did you do it? What product did you build? Why did you build that product? And so on and so forth, to really get that understanding. And so by transparently explaining decision-making like that, you're building a closer bond of trust with the external audience. And the second part is equally as important. By having transparency, you can create accountability. And this is kind of where brands go wrong, which is the idea behind accountability is that you've made a mistake, you apologize, and you make amends. And then you move on. A lot of brands go wrong because they made a mistake and they hope nobody will notice. But the problem is everybody notices everything, and the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so people become skeptical of the motivations behind what you're doing. And so the maxim over here is be transparent, but be accountable. Show your accountability. If you screwed up, the best thing that you could do is quickly say, we got it wrong. And this is what we're going to do about it. And all of us can think about brands in this day and age who have both done it right and done it wrong. So quickly, from a GitLab perspective, just to anchor it for us is, I think we do pretty well in transparency and accountability. We have a public handbook, which is essentially the repo for how we run the company. Everything is there for everybody to see. In fact, if you wanted to, I don't encourage it because you should be paying attention over here, you could find my marketing strategy out there for the world to see. My messaging, my positioning strategy, my personas, and all of that. If we printed out the GitLab handbook, it would be 2,000 pages long. So it's long. And so I like this as an example because I think it causes us as marketers to say, what part of our process can we make transparent? How can I invite people into the conversation with me? How can I just make it so that we're open, we're communicating, and people can see the actions that we take? Your company might not want to have a public handbook, but there are other things in your process that you can do. Okay, third pillar, consistency and dependability. I use this pretty simple equation, trust equals consistency over time. And so with this equation, you know two things. First, trust doesn't happen overnight. It is the result of repeated, consistent experiences that compound over time. And then second, you need to be consistent, which means your audience needs to be able to depend on you. You need to be consistent in your messaging. You need to be consistent in your consumer experience. If you change things on people all of the time, you're really undermining the consistency, component of trust that they have. So again, go back to the bank thing. Invest often or deposit often, withdraw wisely. I'm not saying don't change your product. Everyone should change their product every now and then if you've got a big insight about the job to be done and how it can be used. But be very wise on sort of the way that you do it. Tie the change to that job to be done. Make sure that you're communicating very clearly. So my GitLab example over this is pretty clear. We ship a new version of GitLab once a month. We've been doing it for 130 months in a row. We actually do it on the same day every month. It's on the 22nd. And so the first 5 times we did that, it's probably not a big deal. Then we got to 10, and people were like, oh, wow, they're shipping a new version of GitLab on precisely the same day every month. And now we've done it 130 times, and so our community and our active customers have come to expect this. They actually set their own processes based on what they think that we're going to do. And because we operated in this open core model where they can contribute to our product as well, so that the rest of the GitLab world can get it, that consistency builds a lot of trust. So this is a really good case study. So as marketers, think about how do you create consistency? How do you create it in your operational process? Like, what operation strategy can you adopt that gets to consistency that your customers are asking for? All right, fourth pillar, customer advocacy. I think I probably should have put this as the first pillar. I think advocacy is sort of the name of the game. If you can't tell stories from the voice of the customer, they're just not going to be as strong. People want proof. People want to see customers like them. This is core to if anyone has read Crossing the Chasm, and I'm going to just guess 98% of you have. This is core to how you cross the chasm. The idea that you go from one type of audience to another type of audience, and the distinction between the two is their psychographic profile. And the most important thing that you can do when you go from one audience to the other is have the new audience be able to reference people like them. So customer advocacy is key, and what you want to do is think about it as a holistic program. Case studies are great, even though I hate the name case studies. They should be called customer success stories. But it's a holistic program. It's everything. It's case studies, it's advisory boards, it's anything that you can do to identify, recruit, and amplify the voice of the customer. Because what you're doing is building momentum and trust in the market. Okay, the final pillar of trust is what I call the trusted customer journey. So I'm going to take you on a little journey. The buyer's journey is awareness, consideration, purchase, and so on and so forth. I believe that there's a trust journey as well. And the trust journey looks like this. It kind of goes along the same journey. It starts with awareness, but then you're going to go through this thing called reputed trust, and then you get to, please advance, earned trust. So think about reputed trust as an on-ramp to earned trust. Reputed trust is essentially what people think about you. It's your reputation, it's your brand. But it's not the final place that you need to be. You need to be at earned trust, and your job as marketers, our job as marketers, is to move people from reputed trust to earned trust. And the only way to do that is through experiences. They have to have experiences. But what happens if something goes wrong? I call this the broken trust feedback loop, because things will go wrong. And so go back to the first principle in transparency and accountability. Understand what went wrong, communicate it, make amends, move on. And we can all think of brands who have done this in the right way. But I want to hold on this concept for 1 second because I think it's super important. So a lot of people think that the deepest erosion of trust is when you get betrayed, when that one thing goes wrong. But again, I think we can all think of brands who got it wrong, apologized quickly, were able to move on. And so I think the worst thing is actually when brands withdraw. By the way, I could say the same thing about people, your spouse, your colleague. When people stop caring about the work that you're doing or your wants and needs, the same is true with brands and products. When they stop caring about the customer and they're not obsessed with the customer or the job to be done from the customer, that's the worst sort of betrayal of trust. And so this is where everyone here has superpowers, because I think the superpowers of a marketing team and a marketing professional is preventing withdrawal. And you're doing that by being the voice of the customer, by putting the voice of the customer front and center in all the decision-making that you've got, by being transparent, by communicating clearly and all of that. And so we should be thinking about that as we put together a go-to-market strategy. How do we prevent this idea that people can feel like you're not paying attention to them? So I'll end where I started. I'm going to go back to the experience at eBay, which was a foundational experience that I had in shaping my belief about trust. That story that I told about introducing a dispute resolution platform that we thought it was going to be great. It ended up being great, by the way, but we got it wrong on the first try. I think that shaped the way that I think about this framework. Had we, right out of the gate, led with our values, been transparent and accountable, communicated clearly, we were dependable, and all of that, I think the initial launch would have been better. But we learned a lot from that. We were able to replicate that for other products that we did. And so I'm going to end with this. Trust can seem really overwhelming. It can seem like everything and nothing at the same time, as I said earlier, but it really doesn't need to be. So let me give you 3 things that you can do immediately to go back to your office and start a trust program. First, start by mapping the customer journey. It's the easiest thing, most straightforward thing to do. What I like to do is I map the customer journey and I break it out in each customer touch point that I have that my brand or product has with the customer, and I write down what are the questions that they're asking, what anxieties do I think that they have, and what programs, what messages, et cetera, can I do to counteract it. So I would start with that. Second, create a trust scorecard, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And the same is true over here. So I like to create my scorecards out of things like Net Promoter Score. I look at customer satisfaction. I look at changes in brand attributes over time. Ideally, you see attributes like this brand is for a person like me. And then, of course, the financial gold standard, which is net dollar retention. Somebody increasing their business with you is the standard of they trust you more and they find value in their service. And then finally, iterate. This building trust, again, it takes time. And also do it with a task force. Nobody owns trust in a company. There's no one person. And so the only way to do it right is to find your posse, bring them together, and then create a task force, do experiments and programs, and see how you're doing with the metrics that you've identified above. And so that's it. As you can tell, I'm a pretty insane nut when it comes to trust, and I'm really curious. So I would love to get feedback from you or hear about your trust experiences, so drop me a line and let me know how it's going. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's all give Dave a huge round of applause. That was riveting. I was taking pictures, even though I know for a fact the slides will be available later, so that's how good this was. Let's see, until the Slido comes up, if anyone has a question, feedback, something. Right at the back there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you work for GitLab, so would you say that trust is a more important concept when it comes to marketing developers or other crowds, or is it just important?
Yeah, so the question is, GitLab markets to a really technical audience from a developer perspective. Is it more important for that audience than not? I would say no, it's important for all audiences. The interesting thing about it, though, I think, is that you can apply the same framework regardless of the audience that you're talking to. This framework applies to consumers, to business, to the buyers in a business. Again, we're marketing to human beings, the technical champions, and so on and so forth. And by the way, I'm not going to give you any marriage advice, but it also works in marriages. You can apply this framework in how you work with your spouse and your friends, too.
All right, looks like the Slido is blowing up. So how do you communicate negative actions to good customers? So for example, if a company needs to make changes to a product to reduce risk exposure.
Yeah, this is a great question because not all times are you going to communicate really awesome, bubbly news. And you have to communicate something bad. Maybe you're doing a price change. Or maybe you are changing your trust and safety risk profiling, and there's some actions that need to be taken. Or maybe it's on social media, for example, and there's a content policy that needs to be updated. I think the first principle when it comes to this is transparency and accountability. And particularly the transparency part, and linking transparency and values together. The best communications that I've seen, actually, let me say it a different way. The worst communications that I've seen don't link transparency and values. So people don't understand the what, they don't understand the why, they can't connect it with the values that you have as a company, and it creates a lot of skepticism. The best that I've seen is basically a communications architecture, which begins with value, or values, and then leads into here's the change, and here's what we're doing and why we're doing it. It's hard to do that, and requires a lot of cross-functional collaboration at all levels for people to feel comfortable with it. It's a great question.
Thank you, Dave. So we are impinging on our coffee break, so I'll ask you just one last question,
Yes.
Which I'm also curious about. What do you do when you've lost trust with a customer and an apology isn't cutting it?
Yeah. When you've lost trust with a customer, the apology isn't cutting it, which, by the way, is rare. Because I think if you're authentic and you own up to a mistake, most customers will understand that if you communicate it in the right way. But sometimes that's not good enough. And the truth of the matter is that might be the point at which you can't really get back. Like they don't accept that, and they're going to move on. They're going to find competition. And so the best that you can do, the best that I can do in a situation like that is really learn from the experience. Because it's not going to impact everybody. Not everybody's going to have that same sort of behavior afterwards. But the best thing that you can do is learn from that experience and then do better next time.